Excited to see you all. We have one of my favorite topics today, which is how to actually help somebody change their mind or take action, perhaps with a belief they already have but have not turned into action. And doing so in a way that is particularly honest about where we stand in relation to this issue. So we're going to be using a really old framework that I'll teach you about. It's called public narrative, or I'll show you some different versions of it. It dates back at least a couple thousand years as a persuasive framework. There's stuff written on this in the ancient texts that talks about this, and is still very much in use. So this was very much, for example, the explicit training and speaking style of Barack Obama. He was trained in this exact methodology and used it in almost all of his speeches. If you look into them, particularly when he's looking to persuade people to change their minds or take action. So it's a tried and true approach to persuasion. And this particular angle on persuasion comes from the direction of heart. So you might remember we talked last time around that we're going to kind of go from head to heart to hands, meaning logic to emotion to action, right? And it is possible to persuade people from the direction of head, from logic, from coming to them with such a convincing and clear logical argument that they can be persuaded. So I don't want to discount that. That is an option, but it's often a lot harder than we think. In most cases, it is easier to persuade somebody to shift if you can access their heart, access their emotions, give them a reason to care, give them a reason to reconsider. And then once you've got the attention of their heart, the interest, the motivation to care, then the logic has some place to land, right? Because they're interested in it. So we're approaching it from that angle. That's not the only angle from which to persuade people, but it is the one we're going to be working on today. Let me see if I'm able to share screen. Pull up some of our slides here. All right. Can you all see the screen? Just making sure. Yes.
Yes.
Good. All right. So, persuasive strategies. This is kind of what I was already talking about. What messages will most effectively persuade your target and the people around them? Let me be clear about the word target, by the way. We're going to use this throughout the course. In an advocacy context, what that means is the person who you wish to persuade, to either change their mind on an issue, take action on an issue, or maybe stop taking a particular action on an issue, stop doing a thing, or start doing a thing, or do it differently, whatever it is. That's what target means. So in this context, what messages can persuade your target and the people around them? The people around them we're going to get to a lot more next week, because there's a limited amount of persuasion you can do with an individual if they're enmeshed in a social context that has not changed their mind. And for them to go back to a social context and persuade their entire social context to change takes an extremely high level of motivation from an individual. So we often want to persuade the individual and help persuade their social context or the people around them, as it says here. We'll get to that one next week. So of these are kind of some of the angles you can take to persuade people: logical arguments, emotional engagement, self-interest. All have their moment, right? But we're going to particularly work on emotional engagement. It is usually the most accessible and most powerful in most contexts, even when self-interest is at play, by the way. So a lot of people think self-interest is going to be the most persuasive. I'm going to tell you how you will be better off if we do this. And it's seldom as persuasive as we expect. So even if there is very real self-interest at play that could even work to your advantage, often connecting at an emotional level first and then bringing in the self-interest can be really helpful. And similarly with the logic. Even if your logic is absolutely bulletproof, connect emotionally first, then bring in some of the logic, and it'll have more of an open door. So a lot of advocacy is about motivation. It's about having somebody care enough to take action. or to change something, or to do something that's perhaps inconvenient or not easy. Motivation basically is driven by emotions, and our emotions are often linked to our values. So as we work on today's class around persuasion, you particularly want to look for what are the values that your advocacy target has, the person you wish to persuade. What are the values that they have that could be used as an entry point for them to feel kind of ethically aligned with your issue, that your view on this issue aligns with their already existing values, what life is about, what's important in community, etc. Because those are usually the link to emotion. So we're going to talk more about emotion. As you do, think about what are your own values that are underneath your own emotion. This links back a little bit to last week's class, which we didn't get to go into as much depth as I'd wanted, but you get the idea, I hope. That's probably where your emotions come from. They come from your background, your values, etc., around this issue. In terms of delivery, we're not going to focus on that as much here. The EFM, by the way, has in the past done some excellent training specifically around message delivery. And I don't know where we're at on this, Kim, maybe you can speak to this, but Kramer was an instructor who did sort of public speaking training and worked on poise and voice and all of these things. So we're not going to do that here, partly because of time, largely because we're on Zoom, and there's limits to what we can do, but would encourage you to look into it. So what we are going to talk about is what approaches might be most effective with your particular, I'm going to call them decision maker here, same idea as target, person who you wish to change their decision about something. What approaches might be more effective? So let's start with just kind of hearing from you all a little bit. What do you think might be most effective as an approach or an emotion with a sympathetic decision maker? Somebody who already probably kind of agrees with you. What's going to help them get from kind of agreeing to you to actually being motivated to take more action than they're taking right now? See if I can get to where I can see more of the class while sharing screen. Thought this through. Hang on. All right. Anybody have a thought? What emotion might be effective around somebody who is sympathetic to your cause? Sure, see you, and then Peter. And then
maybe pointing out ways that they could actually make a difference.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Star, and then Peter, and then I'll keep going.
Emotionally, perhaps a sense of relief that there would be something that they could do about it if they're already sympathetic to an issue or cause.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Knowing that there's a way forward.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Peter? I'm gonna unmute you, Peter. Can't hear you.
Peter, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm thinking of housing and fire safety, and there's the fear factor that we all, particularly those of us who might have a hard time getting out in case of a wildfire. But then there's also the relief of knowing that we're not alone and our neighbors are concerned, and together we might be able to do better.
Great. Thanks. So let me try to give a really generic response. You all are getting at this with your particular pieces. What we're generally looking for with the sympathetic decision maker is to show them that taking action on this issue will generate some sort of positive emotion for them, right? That it will generate relief, that it will generate perhaps a sense of pride, that it will generate a sense of perhaps feeling the gratitude of members of their community. You're looking to kind of make this attractive with a sympathetic decision maker. What you don't want to do with the sympathetic decision maker usually is bring in negative emotions. You don't want them to feel shame about how they haven't taken action on this thing yet. You you say you're in favor of the environment, but you haven't blank, blank, blank. There are times for that, but generally speaking, and I have to generalize here, right? That's gonna generate resistance and defensiveness in the person. They will explain why they're not taking action on this thing and why they haven't, and it will tend to dig them in deeper to not taking action, their reasons for not taking action. So we want to try to frame this, and we'll get to this in the public narrative stuff we're going to do. You want to offer them a route to action that is connected to their values and that will get them to a really positive emotion. However, if you're dealing with an oppositional decision maker, which is here, right? It can be, you'll generally want to start by offering a route to a positive emotion, right? If you're opposed to this thing, but if you took action on it, you could have a real sense of pride, accomplishment, people in your community would thank you, whatever. Knowing that that probably is not going to be enough for the oppositional decision maker. And then you may want to layer on more negative emotions. If you continue to not take action on this, we will target your voters, we will attempt to vote you out of office, we will highlight your hypocrisy and make you feel ashamed, et cetera, et cetera. If they're already going to be oppositional, then what that does is it means that they continue to be oppositional and they're not going to like you very much for bringing this up in this way, right? But they may start to be much more cautious with their opposition. They may essentially dial down the amount of opposition they're willing to put because they don't like the consequences that you're saying will happen if they continue to be opposition. But don't make the mistake of doing this with somebody who's already in your court conceptually, who you're trying to just motivate to take action on already shared values, ideas, et cetera, which for those of you in Marin is likely to be most of the decision makers. So I will encourage you to do your research on your decision maker, and if at all possible, offer them a route to being in alignment with their own values and to experiencing positive emotions, and be really careful with shaming, blaming, we're going to vote you out, etc. kinds of things. All right, moving on. This just sort of tells you where we're at. We've sort of done the critical thinking bit. So that is, you need something to advocate for. You need to have done your homework around the issues so that you can say, this is the problem. This is a coherent, logical, well-researched solution to the problem. And then we use the emotional connection. So we say, I've looked into this issue, I've researched it, this is why it's a problem, this is how we're going to fix it, and this is why it matters. This is the emotional part. And then we'll get to the action next week. Oops, get this going. So we've mostly covered a lot of this already. I'll just say this is, again, some of this is super old. There's a version of this I've read that dates back to, I think, Rome, ancient Rome, meaning it's in Latin. So generally speaking, action motivators, urgency, anger, hope, solidarity. That last one is you can make a difference, agency, the ability to actually accomplish something. And some of these others, inertia, apathy, fear, isolation, self-doubt, tend to move people into inaction. The reason you might use that, by the way, for somebody who is in opposition is because moving them into inaction works to our advantage. So the reason we might use fear, self-doubt, that you will be isolated, etc., is very specifically to move those in the opponent category into lower levels of action against the issue we're looking to move. And we want to use mostly these sort of more positive ones to help folks who are already on our team, so to speak, move to action. There's one here I want to really highlight for a minute, which is anger. Anger is a particularly powerful emotion. It is often very present, particularly around environmental and social justice issues. It may be one of the dominant emotions for you around the issue you're looking to advocate around. It is a little bit of a playing with fire emotion to use within your advocacy. There are times that really harnessing and highlighting anger can be helpful. If you want to encourage those you're looking to persuade to feel a sense of anger, indignation, self-righteousness, whatever it might be. That's probably not a good word, but there are all these flavors of anger. If you want to invite them to join you in feeling angry about this issue, what I would encourage you to remember is anger tends to be a very intense and therefore fairly short burning emotion. Most folks who work in social change advocacy, ideally you use anger as a core driving emotion sparingly, because it burns people out quickly. And it burns out many really accomplished social change leaders quickly if they are too often using anger as their driving emotion. If you're trying to build a movement around your issue, whether your movement is getting the council on board or creating a citizen action thing, try to use the anger sparingly when you need intense action. If there's a day you need to go protest at the town hall, yeah, that's a day, and on that day primarily to encourage people to connect to their anger. But if you encourage them to stay connected to anger for a year, you will lose most of your participants, most of your audience. So there's more that we could say about that, but I'm trying to get through this quickly, knowing I didn't get as far as I wanted last week. Hopefully that gives you a sense of things, and we'll get into it a little more in some other ways. So I'm gonna basically do a little bit of work in front of the class with Johnny as our example. Then we're gonna go into small groups. I'll give you more instruction before we do that. And you'll be working in groups of 3 or maybe pairs to practice some of this stuff. And what I'll do with Johnny is we'll just kind of go through the issue of small off-road engines. When you're in your group, you can use whatever issue it is that you've decided to focus on for the class. So you can use the small off-road engines if you'd like, or you can use whatever issue you're actually wanting to advocate on. This is an opportunity to kind of practice around that. So Johnny, go ahead and come off mute and we'll just have a quick conversation here. We talked about the small off-road engines and motivating officials at the level of the town council of San Rafael to take action and basically accelerate what the state of California is doing at a statewide level to do that faster and more effectively, et cetera, at the local level. What emotions, given what we just talked about, what emotions are you thinking might motivate some key town council members to take action on this issue?
Well, the town council members that I found working in San Rafael City Council right now are very progressive thinking, and they would tend to fall inside of our kind of group that shares often the motivations and the outlook we have on small off-road engines. So I think positivity on their accomplishments on even having this be a question would be one thing that I can talk to them about and highlight. Gratitude, bringing up different members of the community that I know are grateful for the work that they're trying to do. And then I think I would try to create a shared sense of urgency in trying to get this moving forward. I could cite, for example, the proposition that just got approved by Governor Newsom, 1347, or I can't remember the exact number, but pretty much giving state approval for funding to phase out gasoline engine, small off-road engines. So I don't know, I think having a dialogue around those 3 things, the urgency being the least positive, but the one that has the most kind of, I think it could be complicity associated with that.
I'll just say urgency can be a positive thing. So there's urgency to accomplish this thing that we can feel really proud about. We can feel really excited about. Urgency itself isn't negative. What are some really positive emotions they might feel if they were to take action on this much more quickly than the state of California?
Right. I think they would feel pride at being at the forefront of something that's occurring. They would feel like they could be an example that people can follow often, and that gives a sense of accomplishment, right? Where if you're doing something that is a little bit before its time, people can get motivated to follow suit, right?
Great, perfect. Let's move to the other question here. Since we're looking at a town council, they're of course always keeping an eye on what their residents, what their voters think. So we, to the point of not only bringing our message to the decision maker, but also to their social context, what emotion do you think might motivate the residents of San Rafael to want to take action on this issue?
Yeah, San Rafael people might be motivated by kind of the impact that the small off-road engines have on their community. I think a lot of residents are very aware of the noises and impacts happening around them. And so I think they would be motivated by desire for the community to be a little bit more kind of, if it's shooting for a more sustainable future, I think it would make residents feel proud that they have policies in place that can make that more possible. And I think people would be often on board and supportive of being able to kind of stand behind personally in their personal decisions, a policy that is moving towards that.
Yeah, great, agreed. I want to bring up one more that we just talked about, anger. So this particular issue of small off-road engines has very significant health effects on people, particularly, of course, anybody who's vulnerable, kids, those with health conditions, etc. It has effects on hearing, it has effects on the respiratory system. So it is entirely possible to get the residents of San Rafael quite angry about the impacts that this is having on their health and the health of those they care about. Probably, if we were to really want to move this forward at the level of San Rafael, there will be a moment where we want to really invite that anger into action. But we want to keep it to a short, constrained time period because it will otherwise burn people out. So we probably sort of build a coalition here, sort of work with the electeds, and then generate some sort of collective action event. You know, it could be on social media, but this sort of brief window where you want to really connect people to all of the negative consequences of this and how upsetting that is, and give that an outlet so that they've been heard, and ideally line that up so that the elected official can respond with this positive action that puts them kind of in the hero position. Heard the anger of our community, saw the opportunity to make us all proud of the kind of community we live in. I took action, we win collectively, right? So that's a way we might set this one up, if that makes sense. All right, let me keep going a little bit here. I've got to toggle between slides and you guys. This is just a reminder of our same slide. So we're assuming for today that we've done all the strategy, that we did all the critical thinking. I want to mention here, we didn't do much critical thinking last week because I underestimated how long we would need for the individual sharing. So there is some additional information available that is on the class page around critical thinking that goes into a lot more depth than we were able to go into last week. I'll encourage you all to look at that. But we're assuming for today that we've done all of our analysis. We're in narrative, heart space, and we feel rock solid that we have researched this thoroughly. Now it's time to actually get to the persuasive framework. So make mental note here. You don't necessarily have to write all of these down or anything, but just kind of think about how you want to approach it. And again, I'm going to do a sample version of this with Johnny, and then we'll go off into groups. And board members and other folks here will be facilitating some of those groups to keep it on track. The framework we're using, public narrative, breaks down into 3 chapters. And I'll tell you all 3 now, so you have a sense of it. There's story of self, story of us, and story of now. That may not make much sense by itself. It will as we go through it. It's important for this persuasive framework to, as much as possible, stick firmly to one category until you've fully explored it before moving into the next category. Again, if you want to go see some excellent examples of this, take a look at many of Obama's speeches. I gotta adjust here. So, story of self is, why am I personally motivated to do something about this issue? Essentially, you're inviting your audience. So in this case, Johnny, we're going to imagine that the audience is a key member of the Town Council of San Rafael on the issue of small off-road engines. So you're going to speak to, why am I personally motivated around this issue? What is my personal, unique experience around this that makes this matter to me? You might talk about the values that it connects to. You may just talk about your own perspective. It could be your own emotions around it. It's a moment to really kind of open your heart. One of the ways we get other people to connect to motivation and emotion is to show our own. Why am I motivated? What emotions do I have and why around this? That gives other people permission to find why they might care about it, what emotions they might have, why they might want to take action. So we're basically modeling it for the person we're looking to persuade. But it's important to stick firmly in self, because if we're able to really cleanly say, I invite you to look at this from my perspective, then they can do that. But if you start to blend it with, I think everybody would see it this way, why don't you see it this way? It'll get really muddled and they get defensive. If you can stick really cleanly in your own perspective, there's nothing to be defensive about. You're just telling them in a really honest and open way your own personal experience. So it minimizes defensiveness, and in many cases allows somebody to kind of open the heart a little bit and be like, oh, I see why that's upsetting from your point of view, huh? Without you projecting onto them or telling them what to do or anything. So this is kind of the enrollment phase where we get them to understand why we care. So with that, Johnny, let's just do, what I'm gonna have us do in the small groups is, you're gonna take about a minute each to do this. So be ready that you're going to have a timed minute to give your own story of self in your small group of 2 or 3 around the issue of your choice. And Johnny's going to model it for us, and we'll give a little bit of feedback here, and then we'll break off into groups. So Johnny, tell me, and I'll give you about a minute so that we get a sense of things. Why do you personally care about this issue? What's your story of self around small off-road engine?
Yeah, well, I have quite a few reasons why I care about small off-road engines. And I think that it comes from a very interesting perspective, because I work very closely with small off-road engines. I work in the trades. So almost every day I'm engaging with some kind of small off-road engine. A lot of it is with chainsaws, leaf blowers, lawnmowers. I don't work landscaping, but I do construction. And so it affects my life very personally, partly because a lot of these engines are very loud, right? So when I'm working, I have to be very conscious, and it's inside of my work ethic to be using earplugs all the time. But often on the job site, I encounter especially a lot of other immigrants and Latinos that don't have the work culture or the capacity to buy earplugs, and that's not like something that they know about. So they're just really harming their hearing by using these really loud off-road engines. I've even gone up to some of these folks on many occasions and given them earplugs when they're working with chainsaws or stuff like that. Another reason is because I've many times been in the position of using small off-road engines, because when it comes down to it, everyone wants work done on their place if they have the financial capacity. And neighbors that hear me working with these engines that isn't for my benefit, right? I have to protect myself against that, come up to me and complain a lot about all the noise I'm making, right? And so I'm telling them, this is not my fault. This is just because your neighbor wants a new fence or something. But it becomes kind of my issue, because I'm creating all this noise inside of a neighborhood, right? So for those 2 reasons, it's like kind of a daily thing for me where I'm engaging with the impact of these small off-road engines.
Great. Thanks, Johnny. That's great. So one thing I want to highlight here, he talked a little bit about the experience of seeing other coworkers using small off-road engines not using hearing protection. And a way to do that, if you're within this sort of connecting this story of self piece, is to talk really clearly about the emotional impact of that on you. So Johnny, we talked about this a bit earlier, but for example, the emotional impact on you is essentially worry and concern for the well-being of these other folks you're seeing using these engines without the appropriate protection. So you could highlight that. And other than that, yeah, that was a good example. So you're speaking about how it affects you, why you care about it. And ideally, as you all are doing this, connect this to what emotions you therefore feel about this issue, how it connects to your values in life and so forth.
Can
So
I ask,
that's phase one. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask a quick question about this? Are you saying that each of these things is distinctive and should be addressed to some extent separately, or to me they seem so interconnected? I was already struggling with, well, if I'm motivated to do something, it's so directly related to my values. I'm not sure if I could pull those apart.
Yeah, I agree. So the 3 sub-bullet points here, don't worry about, addressing those in some really specific way. It's just to give a general sense of what might be within the story of self, but you want it to feel organic. So you might say, I first ran into this issue back when blank, and it made me feel this way. And now when I see it, it makes me feel this way, and it has this impact on my life, right? That's kind of what we're looking for in a story of self. The most important thing is just to remember you're inviting them to see it from your point of view and only your point of view. You're trying not to speak on behalf of anyone else in this phase, because that's what will minimize the defensiveness. Oops. But we can take just a couple of questions. So did anything come up in your small group that you particularly want to ask a question about before we move into the next one? Tracy, go ahead.
Well, this didn't come up in group, but and apologies if you're planning on covering it later, but I was curious what your position is about petitions, because it strikes me that often people try to start a petition when they're concerned about an issue. And what I've seen is that decision makers really hate that because they feel like you've ganged up on them and they get very defensive and like, why didn't you talk to me and all that stuff. But at the same time, a petition is a really easy way to spread the word about an issue. They just tend to, virally go around, and also to show the decision makers that it's not just you who feels this way. And so I was just curious, your thoughts about petitions and if there's a certain time or place for that to happen.
Yeah, there is. And that's actually going to be our focus next week. So next week,
gotcha.
The action part, right? When is it time to do a petition? When is it time to do a letter to the editor? When should you do a social media campaign? When do you march in front of somebody's office with signs? All the different actions we can take. We'll get to that next week. If you're looking at today's content, though, it could be a way to inform the petition. So the petition, for example, could use this format as a way to at least be a little bit persuasive. Given that it's signed by many people, it has to be a little more we, right? So you could say, we are impacted by this issue in this way. We feel this way about it. We therefore, want the following action. Let's get through the next couple steps and it'll make sense. But similarly, if you were to write a letter to the editor, this same format that we're working today works well in that context as well as a letter to the editor. I've written a lot of letters to the editor using this format. So, all right.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Anybody else? Any questions from our first run at this? Or really important learnings you want to make sure to tell us about? Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, something that came up in my group is when you're telling your own story, how do you avoid creating, and in a sense, you're trying to go for solidarity, but how do you avoid sort of tribalism? So if you talk about, those of us who moved to Marin wanted it to be quiet and we didn't want to hear leaf blowers, all the time, how do you then avoid putting a us versus them in terms of, say, the issue of the economic survival of the people who are using the leaf blowers?
A good question. So what you would want to do, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is you want to know what are the values that you potentially have in common. So this is the next phase of this persuasive framework, is to find where are the points we have in common. And you want to tell your personal story in a way that lines up to what you think are going to be values that are held in common. So perhaps with the person you're looking to persuade, the value you have in common is wanting a good life for your kids. You might have different descriptions of what that looks like and what the priorities are, but if you can at least connect on that as a value that you share, and for them to understand why for you that connects to this particular issue, it may give them space to say, okay, fine, I don't feel that way about it for my kids, but I care about my kids. This is somebody who cares about theirs. This matters to them. I can at least understand and empathize in that way. And one of the things I would say, Susan, given the way you just phrased your example, is that's one of the reasons it's important to stay in the I. So you used a phrase of those of us who moved to Marin wanted the following. And what you may trigger is defensiveness in this person who says, well, I also moved to Marin, and I know people who moved to Marin, and that's not why we moved to Marin, right? So if you stick really cleanly in the I, there's nothing for them to be defensive about. That's why that's important in this model. Anybody else? All right, let's go into the next phase of things then. Get this back out. All right, hopefully you all can see this. Oh, I didn't get screen sharing back on, hang on. Okay, great. So our next phase is kind of what Susan was talking about in a way. What's the story of us? How do we now start to connect our personal story to have this sense of solidarity? The questions I put here, just again, for your consideration, not to explicitly answer when you're doing this, is why should the community care about this? Who is affected? Which community values are connected to this issue? You want to kind of build a bigger picture where you're inviting the other person in to be on your side of the table or on your side of the issue and to say, yeah, we do kind of agree on this. That can be a stretch depending on who you're dealing with, right? But that's the attempt here. So the story of us is, the us is basically a combination of me plus the person I'm talking to. What's the us between the two of us? And some sense of what is the bigger us beyond the two of us who are having this conversation that may be common to many members of this community. That's where, for example, Susan, your comment about those of us who moved to Marin for the following reasons, you could say that. You could say many of us moved to Marin for the following reasons because we have these values. And I hope you might share some of these values or have your own angle, and I'd be open to hearing them, right? So you want to create some of that space for them to say, well, that's not why I moved here, but yeah, I hear you on the values, and this is how I feel about those values, and so on. So that's what we're looking for. So ideally, your story of self is geared towards what's going to be a good connection to the story of us. It's, I care about this issue because blank, 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 and it connects to these values and these emotions for me. And I think this particular value probably connects for you. These particular emotions may be felt by you and by others in our community around this issue. And then we'll move to the action piece next. But for now, we're going to keep cleanly to just this solidarity piece. Johnny, we'll use you again as our test example here. Thanks for being willing to be on spot in front of everybody. And you'll go through it for the story of us is now you talking to a particular member of the San Rafael City Council who you think you can move from being supportive to being supportive and taking more action than she's currently taking. So what's the story of us that you could tell her? Why should she and you see this the same way? Who in the community also might care? Who's affected? Go for it.
Yeah, well, in this particular case, I would be speaking to, or trying to speak to this city council member of San Rafael called Micah Lawrence Guladi. She, I recently was aware that she was part of the master class at EFM a couple of years ago. So there's a common ground already established that we can share. And in our conversation, kind of looking at the bio of other council members and her bio, there's a high priority of working forces towards sustainability, right? And so after my story of self, we can find common ground both in kind of the caring for the community's health, the health and safety, but also like the leisure and comfort of the community in terms of noise. And then I think it would be effective to step it up to another level of where the story of us is we all care about climate change. Being from San Rafael or inside of San Rafael, there's a lot of water that surrounds us. And even though we cannot single-handedly take on climate change and the rise of sea levels, we can address it in small ways. And one of these ways being proactive about a policy towards small engines, right? So another common ground, a story of this council member and myself is she is from Spain and I'm from Latin America. And so we both have a perspective on the role that a lot of immigrant communities can play in a society, and especially in relation to this issue, that often the immigrants are the ones that utilize these tools and are most affected, either because we live in poorer areas with higher population density and therefore more noise, or because we're the ones that directly have to use these tools. So that would kind of be the grounds that I would build a common story with Micah.
Great, thank you. That's a beautiful example, Jonathan. Yeah, I think that pretty much nails it. The last piece in particular, I think is especially powerful. I might encourage you to almost start with that, because that is a good bridge from this is who I am to this is who you are, and then we have this thing in common, and then move into the sort of broader and broader as you go of like the theoretical and how it connects to climate change and sea level rise and all the rest. So as you move into story of us, what you want to do is ideally flow organically into starting to say you're moving from my personal perspective to now the two of us to now the many of us, and the impact on the many of us of this issue. So great shot at that. All right, so we're going to move into our last chapter here, the exciting part of action, and I'll get a little more specific about that. Before I do, I want to just give a little bit of feedback on the section we just did, the story of us. So just as a reminder, those who are in my small group, we worked on this. What you want to make really clear is how will this person feel better about their life if they join you in taking action on this issue? Will they feel proud? Will they feel the support and enthusiasm of their community? And you want to build it up. You want to basically give them a taste of how much better they're going to feel about their life if they join you in taking action on this. Now, one of the things here I want to just touch on, because it's so common, is again, the topic of anger, which is both the rocket fuel and often the cause of burns for advocates. If your personal connection to this issue is anger, you would express that in the first part, story of self. I feel angry about this issue. Try to do that in a way that is clear that you're not angry at the person who you're talking to, ideally. Even if you kind of are, try to minimize that as much as you can. And as you move into the story of us, you're ideally inviting this person to join you in feeling similarly about the issue to how you feel. So if you feel about the issue is anger, you can invite them to join you in also feeling angry about the problem, without it being about them as a decision maker individually. If they get to join you in feeling angry about the problem, then they're much more likely to take action. If they feel the target of your anger, you'll get a lot of defensiveness and it makes it very difficult. So just, we wish we could make all of our emotions be rainbows and light. Sometimes they're not. And if so, be clear about that, be honest about it, and try to keep it so that they can join you in the emotions that you're feeling rather than be the target of those emotions as much as you can. All right, moving on to our last piece here. We're going to go to what's called the story of now. This is the action piece, which we're going to get into more next week. So just to be clear, we've so far done the head part last week, fully analyze the issue, make sure we understand really what is the problem, really what is the best solution we can come up with to this problem. Today is really understand our emotions, our motivation, connect to our target's motivation and emotions so that they care enough to now start to take action on the basis of your logic. And the story of now bearing in mind we haven't developed it, is the specific action you want to ask them to take on this issue. We'll go into this more next week. Maybe it's, would you sign this petition? Maybe it's, you're an elected official, would you please vote yes on the following resolution in 2 weeks? But here's what I want to tell you about the story of now piece. One thing that is really important when you've engaged with somebody in this way, you've ideally connected their emotions, you've connected their desire to do something about this issue. It's really important for them to then feel some emotional reward for taking action on that issue soon, so that they get a taste of, yeah, I do feel good taking action on this issue. So what we're looking for within a story of now is not, would you pass this enormous legislative overhaul within the next 3 years? It's, would you please read this article and let me know what you think by Tuesday? You want something that they can take action on, ideally within 24 hours, if not certainly within several days, and that they're accountable to you for that action. The action doesn't have to be important in and of itself. This is part of the enrolling process. So it's getting them to feel that they are a person who takes action on this issue. And so the easier and simpler you make it, the better, because it's going to then lead you to inviting them to taking the next action and the next action beyond that. So, story of now, for today on our just sort of our practice, you're going to again think of your target. So in Johnny's case, that's this particular city council member. And what is the thing that you want to ask her, in this case, to do within the next few days that shows that it's worked, that you have connected enough to the issue that she is now somebody who wishes to take action. It's her way to demonstrate to you, I've heard you and I care. And then you start to have this teamwork sense, and you go from there in what may be a much longer campaign of a series of nows. Okay, yes, thank you for doing that thing. That's great. That does that. You feel good about it. Good. Okay, here's the next thing I think we could do. And that's how you kind of build your campaign. So Johnny, why don't we do a really quick version of that, and then we'll go to small groups, and then we'll wrap up. So tell us, as your council member, what might you want her to do within the next few days, and how might that align with her values? Go ahead.
Well, I would start out in my circumstance by asking her a couple questions of where San Rafael is on the process of small engines, right? Off-road engines. And that would be, I think, her even engaging with this and kind of turning up to show an appreciation for the fact that I'm involved with this, and then, telling her that the background, this class, for example, is on this issue and kind of attentive to the answers that she might give. The mere fact of receiving an answer and being in communication can help her feel like it's something bigger, and that people are appreciating the communication. Once that is established, I think that's the first step. Then I would go on and ask if she could get a conversation on the agenda to bring to city council that we then can turn up to and listen to.
Perfect. Let's stop there, because it's actually, for our practice, we're going to just do the first of those. I agree. That's an excellent stage 2. Your first one's also excellent. So the first one is, it could be, you could give some breadcrumbs to make this easier. It could be, would you go check in with the following members of your professional staff within the city and find out where this issue is, and could you get back to me by email, or have one of your staff get back to me by email within the next week and just let us know where this issue stands? Thank you. Full stop. Save the next steps for a future conversation. You want to give her something that she can succeed at without feeling like she's going to be overwhelmed with requests. Although, of course, we are then going to have a next one and a next one, but don't make that available right at the start. So that would be the one to go with. Thank you. Great example. So that's kind of the idea of that persuasive framework. Hopefully the exercises give you a taste of it. I would be delighted if you all would move towards taking some action on the issue that you're looking at. So for now, I would say the action I would request, the story of now that I'm going to put before all of you, is to take a little bit of time to take some notes about what you just did today, if you didn't already during it, and try to just kind of refine what you think might be your best argument, your most clear, most impactful story of self, story of us. You may need to research who the decision maker is a little bit if you haven't already, who you wish to influence. If it's a board, if it's, for example, we talked about Caltrans in my group, you might want to research the actual individuals in Caltrans and just get a sense of like, who are these human beings who I'm looking to persuade? Develop your story of us a little bit, and then come ready next week. We're going to really work a little bit more on the story of now part of it, but less as persuasive and more as strategy. What's the right action? What's the right advocacy tactic, essentially, to bring to the situation? So that's my request to all of you, is just polish your notes a little bit, maybe research the audience who you're hoping to persuade, and come next week ready to really work on the story of now, the action and the overall tactics and approach you want to take on your issue. And we'll get a little more guidance on it.